After a tragedy, emotions are running high. We're not necessarily thinking straight.
In my head.
Hey everyone, it's the day after another tragedy here in America. If you didn't hear, there was a shooting over in Las Vegas where somebody was up on a high floor and they were shooting down into a concert area. So we're used to this by now, unfortunately, where we see these tragic acts and there's a lot of news coverage. And what I want to talk about is how we attribute those acts to mental illness and how that could be a mistake. The first thing that I would like to say is that at the time of the making of this video, it's still very fresh on everybody's mind. So if you feel like you're having a rough time with this, maybe you're having some suicidal thoughts, please reach out to the suicide hotline, 1-800-273-8255 if you feel like you need to. There's also the crisis text line. You can text anything to 741-741. They'll be able to respond to you. Now, those are services here in the United States. If you're worldwide, I do have some links in the description, some numbers you can call, some chat rooms that you can get into if you need assistance there. Some of the things that I'm going to discuss in this video are from a paper by Heather Stewart. It's called Violence and Mental Illness, an overview. But before I get to that, I want to talk about the reaction to this event last night and what I saw when I watched some news coverage. So last night, as I watched some news coverage as it was unfolding, as we were learning about this story, I saw some newscasters make some generalizations and some assumptions about what was going on, about who was involved in the shooting, why they were involved, what their state of mental health was like. And I want to talk about that quickly before I get into the link between violence and mental illness. Every time we see a tragedy like this happen, we see newscasters and news media personalities say things like, the gunman was mentally ill, they were psychotic, it was psychopaths who did this. Now, these words have a very specific meaning, and there are people who live their lives every day with mental illness, who live with psychosis, who live with psychopathy, and to use these words stigmatizes those people. And for the people who are watching the news, who are reading through the media, they hear these words and it starts to link in their minds the concept of violence and mental illness, and there's a problem with that. The problem is that it stigmatizes people who are mentally ill. It makes us believe that they are dangerous and that we have to avoid them. It also perpetuates this idea that somehow we have to take away the rights of people who have mental illness. Some other words that newscasters and media outlets use that don't have specific meaning, but we should still be cautious about using, are words like crazy, nut job, insane. Now, I completely understand why newscasters, why media outlets, magazines, online personalities, whoever, use these words, because in the moment, while things are happening, I watched it too. It's horrifying. It's disheartening, and you know there's really nothing that you can do immediately to help out the people who are involved. So what happens is we start to feel our threat response system come on. Our amygdala in our brain starts going off, and that takes over our body. It starts to shut down our prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking center, and we start becoming more emotional. We're not being so rational anymore. And this is when we might start to say things like, it was a crazy person, they were a psychopath, and they were doing it for this reason or that reason. We say these things before we have the facts to truly grasp what's going on, and we say these things because we're trying to contextualize our experience so that we feel like we have some kind of control over it, because this is a situation where we have very, very little control. And when we start to come up with reasons and externalize the anxiety that we're feeling inside, it starts to make us feel like we have just a little bit more control and like we're a little bit safer. The problem, of course, is that this is emotional thinking and it's not engaging our rational mind, and we're not using facts to base what we're saying off of. One important fact that we should all be aware of is that mentally ill people are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than to be the people who do a violent crime. What we do know about people who commit crimes is that they tend to be young, male, single, and from a lower socioeconomic status, meaning that they have less access to resources. But in this case, although he was a male, he was an older person, he was well off, he had plenty of access to resources. So knowing that those attributes tend to contribute to somebody going on to commit a violent crime, they cannot perfectly predict who is going to do so. One group who often unfairly gets stigmatized when it comes to violence are people who have schizophrenia or who are on the schizophrenia spectrum. Of all the people who have mental illnesses, the people with schizophrenia are actually towards the lower end of people who are going to commit violent acts. And there's this thought that people who have delusions, especially thoughts that people have implanted thoughts in their brain and that they have to do something, that those are the people who are going to commit violent acts, but that's actually been shown not to be the case. Something that we do know is that people who abuse substances, whether they're addicted or they just use it to cope with life, those people are much more likely to commit violent acts. Something to consider here is that if somebody does have a disorder and they take medication for it, but instead of taking that medication, they use another substance to self-medicate, that could put them at more risk for becoming a violent person. Now, people who have been hospitalized for their mental illness and then are discharged, they are actually much less likely to commit violence than the general population. But when it does come to somebody committing a violent act, it's much more likely to happen to somebody that they know, somebody in their family, a loved one, somebody in their immediate life. It's not likely to be a stranger or a group of strangers as we often see in these tragedies. What it really comes down to is that mental illness is not a predictor for violence, so putting the two ideas together is a mistake. It may be true that substance use may encourage somebody to go on and commit violence, but again, that has nothing to do with mental illness per se. The reasons why somebody goes on to commit a violent act are very complicated, and one theory is that there are a set of beliefs that somebody has to have and a set of actions that somebody has to take before they will commit a violent act. But even this is complicated because we know a lot of people who have violent thoughts and violent beliefs, and we know a lot of people who take action, buying guns, buying weapons, perhaps threatening people, but don't go on to actually do what they're saying. So it's not so simple as looking for one particular factor that makes somebody violent. After a tragedy, emotions are running high. We're not necessarily thinking straight, especially in this tragedy here in Las Vegas. A lot of the news people were there covering a separate event, and they have people that they were worried about, and they're concerned about the lives of their fellow coworkers, of their families, of their friends. And so they may say things that in retrospect may not have been factual, they may not have been the best way to frame the story. We're all human, we all make mistakes, that's okay, but we want to be cautious not to attribute violence to mental illness. And we want to be cautious that we're not encouraging legislation that takes away the rights of people with mental illness because of these tragedies. So what are your thoughts about all of this? I'd love to hear them. Let's discuss them down below. Let's be respectful of each other while we do so. This is not a political thing. I just want to know what you think about mental illness and how you feel about this issue of calling violent acts mentally ill. If you're new to my channel, hello, I'm Ryan Liberty. Thank you for coming. I know this isn't the best circumstance to be introduced to me in. However, I have over 250 videos here on mental health. I continue to do some, so if you're interested in mental health, hit subscribe and hit the bell after you hit subscribe to get notified each time that I do a video. Thank you for taking the time to think about this with me, and my heart goes out to everybody who's been affected by this tragedy in Las Vegas and the tragedies that continue to occur across this world.